But I want to kick off the program by crossing to Victoria and catching up with the former Premier of that state, Jeff Kennett. Thanks for joining us, Jeff. Very interested in a story on the front page of The Australian today where you and another former Premier, Campbell Newman, have criticised government's propensity to ask for reviews into important decisions. This story tells us that the federal government has got 72 reviews, or commissioned 72 reviews over the past year. Is this is this a way of avoiding decisions or getting them right?
Well, good afternoon, Chris. Yes, I think it is a way of avoiding decisions, and it's been a trend that's been developing now for a number of years that politicians are so scared to make decisions that they try and put out the grunt work to others to do before they actually make a decision. And that also applies to public servants. So public servants are either now pushing the decision-making further down the food chain or pushing it out into the commercial world to have the commercial element doing the work that they should be doing. And it's not just the federal government. It's been happening at state levels as well. And my concern is a number of factors. One, it's very expensive. Secondly, it defers decision-making and therefore you have uncertainty. And of course, thirdly, it increases the cost of government to the community as a whole. So there are a number of reasons why this list that was published today is so extreme. Now, that's not to say that some areas don't need review, and one or two of the Royal Commissions obviously do. But there seems to be increasingly a propensity for the politicians to overlook the bureaucracy that we all hire, and for the bureaucracy also to farm out the work to the commercial sector.
You talk about a trend, Jeff Kennett, but of course there's reference in that story, and we all remember only too well that under the Rudd Labor government there were hundreds of reviews, more than 400 reviews, a veritable feast of reviews and recommendations. So I suppose on this score the coalition is righting the ship to some degree.
Well, it may be doing a bit better, but again, I think this number just says that the wheel is still turning. And, you know, I work on the basis that if you employ good people in the bureaucracy, you employ them with particular skills to help you as politicians make decisions. And this concept that there isn't enough good value system, that there isn't enough experience within the public service and within the political ranks to make decisions. If your values are good, then 80–90% of the decisions you're going to make are going to be right. Why do we simply feed so many in the private sector when we elect politicians and they hire bureaucrats to make decisions on our behalf?
I tend to agree with your thesis, and I'm very much a small government person, and I think this is part of it. This is the way you build an ever-growing bureaucracy, is to govern this way. But let's just pick at some of the ways or reasons this is happening. One of them surely is the influence of upper houses, in the federal government's case, the Senate. In order to negotiate any sort of reform through the Senate, you've really got to make sure you consult very widely and pick off every particular interest group.
Yes, well, that might be so. And where there's inquiries within the political system, I don't mind that. So if the Senate wants to set up a committee to review something, that's fine. But, you know, you can literally bleed to death with the number of cuts that you impose on yourself and the community by trying to overly consult. You're elected to govern, and particularly at a federal level where you only have 3-year terms and really 2 years of effective government before you go into election mode, it's even more important to be prepared to make those sorts of decisions. So when I was in office last century, and I know times have changed, we only had one major inquiry into drug reform, and the rest of the time we took advice from our bureaucrats, we made decisions, and we were prepared to back ourselves in on those decisions. And I just fear that this new world says, as you said, Chris, consult, consult, consult. But even when you consult to that level and to that end, you're not necessarily going to make a decision that is in the best interest of the country. You're trying to appease all groups. And leaders are elected to govern. They're not necessarily elected simply to be popular.
Now, refresh my memory if you can, Jeff Kennett, but I think when you won power, you had control of the upper house as well. So you were able to actually take decisions and implement them. That's the way I'd like to see politics operate all the time, as the voters who can then pass the verdict on what you've done. But of course, Campbell Newman also in Queensland doesn't even have to bother with an upper house. So I'll come back to this point. Is it perhaps the political system and the trauma of having to get reform through the upper house that forces government to behave in this way?
Well, Chris, I've often believed and still do that the public of Australia respect and want leadership. They're not always going to agree with everything you do, but as long as you explain what you're doing, and then, as you say, they can pass judgment at the next election. What really upsets me, and I think right now is upsetting Australians as we go through this period of rapid change, disruption everywhere, another review into superannuation when you're trying to prepare for your non-working life, is that the community is confused and no one is able or is prepared to actually advocate the reasons why we're making changes or making decisions. And I would much rather have a group of politicians backed by a bureaucracy, well qualified, who have the courage to govern and to make sure that where there's an inquiry or a royal commission, it's done for a very real purpose, and that is to bring about constructive change. So the Royal Commission into child abuse, good example, etc., etc. But so much of these examples here are just deferring what surely public servants and politicians should be doing. Yes or no? Give people certainty. Let us get on with our lives rather than having these issues which are not only financially costly, but they absorb a great deal of time and take those involved away from their primary purpose.
You make a great point when it comes to the superannuation review. I mean, heaven help anyone trying to plan for retirement. When you don't know what's happening to super, the taxation arrangements keep changing. There's proposals to change negative gearing, so you don't know whether to sink some money into a property, and yet we're expecting people to make long-term decisions.
Well, and it's not only for those who are now past their revenue-generating period of life. It's for those who are getting close to that period. And it also applies to the young. What should they be doing? I actually support having a compulsory contribution because we're all going to live longer, and the more independent we can be of governments in our retirement, I think the happier we'll be. But why is it that governments change the rules all the time and simply reduce an individual, a family's understanding of what they're going to be able to do as the years advance? And, you know, if ever there was one issue that should be bipartisan within the parliament, it should be superannuation. And both parties should be involved, and both parties should agree to the rules and then leave them alone for 20 or 25 years. Give the public a break from this continual change, which simply undermines our confidence in how we live our lives. And we've only talked about one subject, and we haven't got all day. Yeah, because I could mention another dozen.
Well, we've got a bit of time, Jeff Kennett, so I did want to pick your brain on at least one other where you've got personal experience that has been reviewed to death and where there have been countless government interventions, federal or state, that have created a disaster, and that is the national electricity market, the national energy market. Now, your own state now, with new 50% renewable energy goals and the closure of coal-fired power stations, there are predictions, great trepidation about how you'll get through this summer without blackouts and brownouts. We've seen what happened in South Australia. The same fate probably awaits New South Wales if the Liddell coal-fired power station is shut down. What on earth needs to happen here, and who can drive it, Canberra or the states?
Well, Chris, it should be done predominantly by the Commonwealth with the cooperation of the states. And while I believe and accept climate change, there's no one out there advocating why we've got to move slowly to a new environment rather than getting there overnight. So in Victoria, we're moving there rapidly. The government imposes new taxes on the French operators of our power station down in the Yallourn, so they close it down. We now have no fundamental base provision of power, electricity. We are now a net importer of electricity from other states in the country, when only a few years ago we were the producers of the cheapest electricity and gas. It is an absurd situation. So we need to have a clear program as to how we're going to move to renewables, etc., how we're going to have wind, we're going to have sunshine, we're going to have batteries to back it up and to store, so that we don't put ourselves at risk. How are we going to get through this summer? You asked the question. Only one way: constant prayer. And that prayer will come at a much higher price. And that cost is affecting industry already, not just in Victoria, but around Australia. And if we're not careful, those who demand an immediate change in terms of climate change, of stopping selling coal, we'll only end up cutting our nose off to spite our face. We need to make sure we move from one system of provision to the next in a responsible way. And at the moment, the emotions of the issue is actually driving the agenda. And I don't think there's anyone out there clearly articulating why it is that we've got to move in a responsible way, when, after all, Australia is already meeting its targets. For goodness sake, we've already done a great deal. We don't want to now accelerate so quickly that we actually, as I said, cut off our nose to spite our face.
Spot on. I mean, there's this presumption in the debate perpetuated by many that Australia is indulged in inaction, where you can point to perhaps only one or two other countries in the world that's paid a higher economic price to meet climate goals. The question about your prayers, I suppose, is whether they're offered to a deity or to Gaia itself. On another climate-related issue, and one where reviews have killed off project after project, is the matter of dams and water storage. We've had dams knocked back and dam upgrades knocked back in South Australia, Victoria, New South Wales and Queensland. What needs to be done there?
Chris, I need all day now. If ever there was one issue that frustrates me more than anything else, this is a country without a vision. If you asked our political leaders where they want Australia to be by their policies and via their policies by 2050, they would not be able to tell you. And this issue of dams is ridiculous. It's coming as a response to the drought. Dams should not just be there to collect water from the sky. Dams should be there to collect water wherever it falls in Australia, to move the water around, to provide sustainability for our agricultural development, and to open up our arid areas now. We as a country have no national long-term water policy. We have no national agricultural policy. We have 4 billion people living just to our north, and we should have a vision to be able to feed 1 million of those people. I have been telling this to political leaders since John Howard, Labor, Liberal. No one has any concept of what we need to do in order to protect ourselves and to earn revenue and to create employment. As I said, I read the papers today. The National Party are talking about spending money on dams today. Isolated dams in certain areas. You need a connected system of dams to move water around the continent from where it falls to where it's going to be needed. And the other thing, if you've got me going now, the other thing is we are so wasteful with water. We use it once. In London, they use water 7 times. We just throw it out. And yet water is the most important ingredient, both for human beings and the quality of our soil, after air perhaps. And we have no vision and no policy whatsoever for a national water scheme and a national agricultural scheme that'll take us to 2100. Anything else you wanted to ask me?
Well, no, Jeff Kennett, I can hear our viewers around the nation, particularly in the regions, cheering in agreement with what you said there. And water, there's this kerfuffle about recycling water now. Every drop of water you ever drink has been recycled. Believe me, it's a perfectly enclosed system. Really good to get your thoughts on that, Jeff Kennett. One thing, I know you don't have all day, one other matter of national significance you could probably help us clear up today is I know you're, apart from being a great Hawthorn man with the scarf there in the background, you're a great advocate for the future of Aussie rules football, of the AFL. So in that spirit, I was wondering whether you might loan my club, the Adelaide Crows, Alistair Clarkson for a couple of years.
No.
Fairly emphatic then. Well, perhaps one of his understudies then. Thanks so much for joining us, Jeff Kennett.
Well, we've spread our understudies right around the country. I think now 7 of Alistair's assistant coaches now are senior coaches in the league. We are the university of the AFL. We train people up, administrators, coaches, and also footballers. So good luck to you and your team. The answer, no.
Thanks very much. Appreciate your time, Jeff.
Righto, Chris. Have a good day.